Within the 1960s, Mumbai had a monster, one who didn't stalk the rich, the powerful, or the famous. Instead, he would hunt the poorest people, the ones that nobody would notice missing. His name was Raman Raghav, and for years, he slipped through the cracks, killing dozens with nothing other than a metal rod, a rock, and terrifying patience. This story isn't just about murder, it's about how a whole city lived in fear, and how the police almost let a serial killer vanish into the crowd forever. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. If you are new here, I hope you're all doing so well. Welcome back to another true crime and makeup episode. Oh yeah. As you know from the intro, we are back today with a true crime and makeup episode about Raman Raghav, one of the most infamous serial killers in Indian history. And believe me, this man, a complete POS, a complete monster. Strap in because you're in for a wild ride. If you are new here, hi, my name is Anna. I am a certified yapper. One day I decided I'm going to hop on the internet, yap about true crime, and I do it twice a week, every single week on a Wednesday and Sunday. So if true crime is your jam, I highly suggest you subscribe, get the notification bell on, because like I said, I'm here for you twice a week, every single week, and it's free. And I don't know about you, but I love free stuff. Any details you need regarding me, myself, and I will all be listed down below in the description. But without any further rambling and any further ado, let's get into the horrifying, terrifying case of Raman Raghav. I love when you're just talking to the camera and very quickly realise that your mic was not plugged in. But thank goodness we recognised it early, so problem solved. Where was I? Oh yeah, so you don't want to start like at the crime scene or the police file. You want to start at the noise and the mess of the world that made him. And let me tell you, Raman Raghav, his beginning, this was nothing short of the breeding ground of a man that your mother tells you to stay away from. So, Raman Raghav, he was born sometime in the mid to late 1920s. Now, the exact date is not known, but people do believe it would have been sort of like 1928, possibly 1929. And he was born in what now would be known as India, in an era before his name would become synonymous with horror. Now, I will admit, the sort of birth records of this man with exact dates is really hard to pin down, if not impossible. And that is because back in this time, families who were really poor, they didn't have the privilege of having birth paperwork, birth documents, birth certificates. A lot of babies at this point who were born into poor families, they were born into cramped, sun-beaten rooms where the walls practically breathed heat and mosquitoes. They would treat you like you were an all-you-can-eat buffet. Now, the British Raj very much still gripped India at this point, and the gulf between the rich and the poor wasn't just a gulf, it was in fact a canyon. That gap was so large. And if you were born into a low-income, poor family, just as Raman Raghav was, your life wasn't mapped out by dreams, but by the limits of survival. Now, Raman's early life, this was far from nurturing. There was not a single part of his environment that was nurturing. He was born into poverty, and in this time, it wasn't just a condition that stole your comfort. It robbed you of any options. His father was reported as being a very strict individual. He was also known to be a very violent and dominant figure in Raman's life. This was the kind of man whose discipline was more about control and overpowerment than it was any form of guidance. He didn't care about offering guidance and nurture to his son. He just cared about being able to control an element of his own life. And for Raman's father, that was controlling Raman. That was the only element in his own life that he had full control over. And unfortunately, this monster would abuse his power and in turn abuse his own son. Now, Raman's mother, like many other women at this time in India, she was overworked, underfed, and her whole life's purpose at this point was just trying to keep her family alive. She didn't have a spare moment to be a cushion for her son. She didn't have a spare moment to play the nurturing mother. Raman was never the centre of anyone's world. He wasn't the centre of anyone's affection. In fact, he was just believed to be another mouth to feed and another problem to take care of. And in households like this, where survival trumps affection, empathy is usually the first casualty. It's usually the first emotion to go, the first trait to leave. From a very early age, Raman had showed very notable signs that he wasn't like the other children. Other neighbours would later recall that he was always cold, he was distant, he was always off in his own little world. He never really cared to acknowledge or spend time with any of the other children in the neighbourhood. Other boys and other children in general, they were, playing in the dirt, they were chasing around chickens, and Raman, he just sat by himself, staring at the pavement. And listen, for all we know, there was a big army of ants carrying one of their leaders back to their anthill or something like that. There might have been. But Raman was just so distant. His lights were on, but no one was home. People very quickly began to notice that the staring off into the distance or staring at the floor and withdrawing from everyone else in society, it wasn't the kind of bored daydreaming that you and I might do. It was almost like he was dreaming of something a bit more vicious, a bit more calculated. And let's just say the kind of daydreaming that makes you think, is my knife drawer in my kitchen locked? Or, do we need to hide every single sharp object in the house? Now, very early on, there would be rumours in the neighbourhood that Raman was abusing animals, like all these monsters do. They always go after these defenceless little animals. There was chickens disappearing. There would be dogs limping and whimpering after leaving an area that Raman had been seen in. And listen, I hate to say this, but it isn't unusual in rural areas of poverty for children to lack empathy toward animals. It's not really something they're taught or something they're brought up with. But with Raman, this just went to the extremes, because he wasn't just taunting the animals and chasing them. He was physically abusing them. He wanted to cause them physical pain. He very much enjoyed watching animals and other people suffer. He got pleasure out of others' sufferings. It was almost as though he believed that everyone else should suffer as much as he did, if not more. And that's the kind of detail that gets missed in the moment, and then years later when you look back, hindsight is 2020, it's a great thing. It is like this big flashing neon sign that says, "I'm a wrong one. Put me in jail." Now, whilst it was hard to find details on any schooling or education that Raman had, what we do know is back in this time in India, schooling was sparse. So if he did attend, he didn't attend often. And he certainly didn't stay long. Classrooms at this point, they were so overcrowded, and education for the poor wasn't a priority. So it wasn't unusual for young men and boys like Raman to drop out of school early. Because honestly, sometimes that was the only option they had. Because it was sort of written in the sand for boys like Raman that, they were never going to go on to become a scholar. They would be viewed as cheap labour, which is just heartbreaking, because everyone should get a strong start in life. They should have the opportunity to build their dream career and make something of themselves. And listen, if they want to do labour work, great, but it should be fairly paid. But for Raman, he was just seen as someone who could be used and abused, overworked and underpaid. It is harrowing. Now, whatever schooling he did or did not receive, whether this was him just being taught off his mother or father, he was able to do basic reading, very basic levels of math, like level 1 math. And it was enough for him to be able to navigate city streets later in life. He had just enough literacy to be dangerous, but not enough literacy to actually be productive. Now, before Raman would become the Jack the Ripper of India, he started off as many of these weirdos do. He was a petty criminal, So theft, break-ins, harassment, crimes that would blur the lines between survival and utter sadism. He wasn't the kind of man that was stealing bread so he could eat. He was stealing it just because he could. And let me tell you, if someone stole my bread, if someone stole my carbs, they would get a swift backhander because I take my carbs very seriously. Put down my ciabatta baguette. That is just uncalled for. Now, this early disregard for people's property and people's safety, this would just be matched by his growing isolation. Because Raman, he wasn't the village prankster or the neighbourhood rogue. He was the kind of person that you whispered about in a very hushed voice, the kind of person that gave you the creeps but you didn't really want to say it to their face. And listen, if the seeds of murder and sadism is planted in childhood, Raman Raghav, his soil was as fertile as they come. Poverty, abuse, neglect, a very negative portrayal of the world. By the time this man reached adolescence, he was already carrying a toolkit of traits, and these traits weren't favourable. Cruelty, detachment, opportunism. These traits that would one day make him one of the most feared serial killers in Indian history. And just like Rome, these monsters, they're not built in a day. They are forged for years, hammered by circumstances and sharpened by choices. There is a helicopter swirling or swarming around my area near my house. It's very loud and it seems like it's very low. So don't know what's going on there, but there seems to be an awful lot of this happening. I literally just thought there was a police siren there, but it turns out it was just a seagull. Like, can you hear that? Why are they getting so close? Like, are they going to come through my window? Are we going to catch this on candid camera? Okay, it sounds like they're travelling away. Thank goodness. But also, if anything is wrong, I hope everything's okay. So, Raman Raghav, his path into adulthood wasn't a fall. It was steady, it was deliberate, and it was paved by the choices he made. But let's just say the steady and deliberate path he took was one that really just went downhill. One petty crime and one bad decision at a time. Now, by the time Raman was in his late teens, the rural lanes of his youth, they were very much being left behind. These were replaced by chaos and the anonymity of India's growing cities. Cities like Mumbai, then Bombay. These cities were expanding and there was waves of migrants who were coming in looking for food, shelter, work. Or they simply had this illusion of a better life. Now the streets, they would be crowded, the slums were overflowing, and poverty seemed to have this new found smell, a mix of gasoline and rot. That is what these people were living in. And whilst these conditions sound awful, conditions that no one should have to live in, for Raman this was perfect. These conditions offered him what he so desperately wanted, and that was invisibility. Because in this crowd of thousands, no one asked where you came from. No one really asked who you were, what you did, what you're up to. And that was perfect for Raman, especially because no one cares where you were last week or what you did. And I'm sure you can probably imagine it did not take long for Raman to find trouble, because theft and crime, that was his bread and butter. He would start off with small bits of criminal activity like pickpocketing, stealing tools, breaking into tin-roofed houses and stealing whatever he could find in there. But what was notable about Raman's crimes is that it wasn't about profit, it wasn't about the goods. It was all about control. If he could frighten someone, he would. If he could humiliate them, even better. Witnesses from later years, they would remember him as a man with a very short fuse who was very quick to anger. And when violence was needed, Raman, he was disturbingly calm. It was like this was where he thrived. So by the late 1940s, the early 1950s, Raman Raghav, he had already had several brushes with the law. Are we shocked? No. There was arrests, short-time stints in jails, releases, and then just repeat the whole goddamn cycle again, because this guy doesn't learn lessons. The guy was like a revolving door for crime. It just kept going round and round and round. Because every single arrest, one after the other, didn't seem to be a deterrent for Raman. It just seemed to be a training exercise. He would see it as an opportunity of how can I do better next time? By all accounts, it did seem as though Raman Raghav was a man with no ties. He wasn't married, he didn't have any children, or at least none that we're aware of. And whether this was by choice or by circumstance, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it was better for everyone that he didn't have a wife or children. It did appear though that Raman was a kind of man who would avoid any circumstances that might tie him down or give him some form of responsibility, because that wasn't his path in life. Not what he wanted. At this point in time, he is known to the police as a bad mash, just a habitual criminal. But at this point in time, police resources, they were so thinly stretched that you could be a known criminal, but that doesn't mean you were closely watched or monitored. Now, Raman, he was known to be a drifter in spirit, even if he remained in one place physically. He's always moving around. A lot of people said that Raman couldn't hold down a job, or others stated that he simply didn't want to. Because with work comes rules and comes authority that wouldn't be his own. He wouldn't be in complete control. And Raman just had no patience for this. He wanted to be his own boss and the boss of everyone else in the world. So instead of getting full-time work, he would do some casual labour, but for the most time, he just preferred complete idleness. You know, he wasn't really a man with work ethic, at least not work that is legal. In his life, he would fund this by simply living off of theft and scams. So, you know, don't worry about earning money yourself, just steal someone else's hard-earned cash. Now, I have to admit, it is really difficult, if not completely impossible, to pinpoint the moment where Raman Raghav shifts from, you know, a thief into a complete predator. But former acquaintances, they would note certain things about when they started to notice this shift. Stories would emerge of assaults or brutal beatings over very trivial things. He started attacking the homeless and the most vulnerable. This violence was completely unwarranted and it seemed completely pointless. People couldn't understand why he was doing what he was doing. But in later years, it would become very, very clear. This man got cold-blooded satisfaction from the suffering of others. That was it, nothing else. Because if theft was seen as a means for survival, then these attacks, they were something so much darker. A rehearsal for the kind of killing that would make someone infamous. So, by the early 1960s, Bombay, it was a city of extremes. You had this glittering wealth that would suddenly brush shoulders with poverty-stricken people. There was luxury hotels that sat within walking distance of these slums that were just so run down and honestly heartbreaking to see. The slums, as they were called at this point, they were the homes of people who were deemed to be invisible. And to Bombay at this point, these invisible individuals were people who were mentally ill, who were homeless, the ones who were trying to survive and make it through another day. And devastatingly, it would be in amongst these forgotten people, these invisible people as they were deemed to be, that Raman would find not only his camouflage, but his perfect hunting ground. He could do whatever he wanted. I mean, at the end of the day, in his eyes and in the eyes of many others, no one cared about these individuals. They were deemed to be the perfect victims because they had very few connections. They had very few people who were looking out for them. There was no one around them to sound the alarm if they didn't return one evening. And for the police, homeless people, they just weren't a priority. And for someone like Raman, this city was just pregnant with potential victims. And this cruel hunger, this evil hunger inside him could no longer be satisfied by robbing people, breaking into houses, or simply assaulting people brutally. He was ready for something bigger, something more final and permanent, and that was brutal murder. And so this thief would suddenly be born into a killer. And this wasn't out of sudden rage or necessity, it was simply because he wanted to. Because to him, ending a life, deciding when that person's time is up, that was the ultimate act of control, the thing he craved the most. And in the mind of Raman Raghav and many other of these monsters, control is the ultimate prize. The slums in Bombay at this point, they were like a chaotic maze, and again, this just gave Raman Raghav the perfect hunting ground. He knew the streets, he knew them well, he knew the slums, and he knew where the most vulnerable people slept. And when nighttime came, there would be a predator just lurking in the shadows. And what is devastating is the victims in this case, their names are rarely whispered, their names are basically unknown, and their lives, even when they were alive, were often unnoticed. Now, there is believed to be over 40 victims, but because we're unable to get verified details of who these people were, there's only a few I can really talk about. But what we need to remember is these victims were women, men, children. There was no one off limits. These were people trying to survive day to day, people who deserved a better life and people who were never given the chance. Whether their names are known or not, every single victim is just as important, and every single victim went through what these victims did. So starting off, we have a man by the name of Mohan. He was described as being quite a wiry man in his early 40s. He was a former railway porter who lost his job after a severe injury stopped him from being able to carry heavy loads. So there it was, a man who knew work, a man who knew hard work, who was down in his luck because he got injured. This was a man who was once known for his quiet kindness and his laugh that would break the gloom of these train stations. But when Mohan had lost his job, he found himself where many others do, and that was trying to survive in the slums of Bombay, sleeping rough, sleeping on pavements in the blistering heat, and he would sleep rough beneath a railway bridge. It was in June of 1965 when Mohan's body would be found. It was evident that his skull had been crushed in with some kind of blunt, large stone, and his eyes were just staring blankly ahead. No life behind them. The scene was grim, it was shocking, it was horrific. The ground around his body was soaked and covered with coagulated blood, and there would be shattered fragments of his skull just scattered around like some kind of awful, horrifying confetti. There was no signs of struggle in Mohan's death. It was evident that he had been taken by surprise. He had been killed in his most vulnerable state, and that was in his sleep. And what had made this crime just so beyond awful to so many people who knew Mohan is that this man, Mohan, his only crime in the eyes of Raman Raghav was that he lived in poverty. And it's not a crime, of course, but that is how Raman had viewed it. I mean, Mohan, he didn't owe anyone money. He hadn't crossed a dangerous gang. The only thing that he had done was go to sleep on the street, in the wrong place at the wrong time, where he would be found by this monster. Then we have a young woman by the name of Fatima. Now, Fatima's story, I'll be honest, it's harder to piece together. She was a woman who was barely 20 years old. She had fled an abusive home in a distant village, and she had been sleeping rough on the streets because sleeping rough on the streets felt safer to her than the abusive home that she had left. So just imagine the terror that she was living in to see sleeping on the streets as a safer option. Locals remembered her as being very soft-spoken, very timid, but she was resilient. There was nothing that this woman couldn't overcome. She was now doing some local work. She was selling flowers on street corners, and she was quietly dreaming of a better life. Her body would be discovered near an abandoned warehouse, and it was stated that she had been brutally battered beyond all recognition. Her face was so badly bruised and brutally swollen, and it was clear that the fatal blow that caused her death was caused by a really heavy rock that was found nearby, that of course was covered in her blood. And it would be this same but different weapon, this weapon of a heavy rock, that would later link Raghav's crimes. There was so much blood found at the scene of Fatima's murder. The blood had seeped into the cracks in the ground beneath her, and Fatima's murder would send surges of fear through the small community of street vendors. Women who had once spoken about the safety and the society that they had built, they were now whispering in hushed, terrified tones, afraid of who might be listening, who might use this to their advantage. Was this the work of a madman on a one-off? Was it the work of a serial killer, or was there simply a devil that walked among them? Did they have someone in their little community terrorising them? We then have a 10-year-old child by the name of Raju. Raju was only 10 years old, but he was practically on his own, apart from being raised as much as people on the streets possibly could. His parents had died when there was a big cholera outbreak, and this left this little boy all by himself. Ever since his parents died, he was living on the streets, and he was basically having to scavenge for scraps or beg for food. He was sleeping in shadows where the humming of trains never went quiet. Raju's body would be found near railway tracks, and his little body had been completely mutilated. And as you can imagine, this would shatter what little innocence still remained within these slums. People were horrified because quite clearly this maniac, this monster, he would go after anyone and everyone. This little boy's skull was fractured, and his tiny frame had the most brutal markings of a monster. It was clear that he had been the victim of a savage assault. The scene was completely horrifying. There was bits of clothing that had been torn off and just strewn all over the area. There was broken pieces of brick and stone that was stained with his blood. And what is just soul destroying is victims nearby, they had actually stated later that they had heard faint cries the night before, but no one went to check. People were too scared, and people hoped that maybe it was just a baby crying during the night, something that happens all the time. But as we know, and they now know, this wasn't the case, and what was actually happening was an innocent child was being murdered just yards away. Now, as bodies continued to emerge over the years, it was very clear that this chilling pattern was emerging. These victims, they were almost always found near railway tracks, under bridges, at abandoned warehouses, places within and outside the city where outcasts would gather, which also just happened to be the same sort of places where authorities would ignore. Now, the killings, they did seem random, but they were also methodical. Each blow that was administered with precision, intended to kill quickly and silence these victims before they had the chance to scream. And despite the grisly nature of these crimes, despite how brutal and horrific they were, it took the public a long while to actually realise the scale of these murders. There was many people who was chalking it up to gang violence, gang involvement, and also petty crime gone wrong. But how the hell can you say that when a 10-year-old boy has just turned up mutilated? There was actually people who almost had a who cares kind of attitude, because it was homeless people, because it was people deemed by some to be invisible. It was almost like they mattered less. And they don't. Everyone matters. Everyone is created equally, apart from these monsters. But everyone else, the good people, the normal people. Now, as you can probably imagine, the rumours, they would spread like wildfire. Some people were saying this is a work of a serial killer. Ding, 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 you are correct. But other people were saying it was demons or evil spirits who were coming to punish the wicked. Listen, I believe in the paranormal, but I don't think this is chalked up to the evil spirits or demons. Many people also started speculating that this serial murderer, the ones who believed it was a serial killer, that they were targeting these vulnerable people because these vulnerable people couldn't fight back, which told them that the killer themselves were a bit of a weakling. The killer themselves should probably hit the gym, because it's evident if they came across someone bigger, smarter, taller, stronger, they wouldn't have a chance. Now, local newspapers, they would publish these really lurid headlines which would strike fear and panic within the public, but also create this morbid fascination. For people who were still living within these slums, the fear was palpable. You could feel it, you could sense it, you could hear it. People were desperately trying to stop sleeping outdoors. Some were trying to sleep in strangers' homes. Some were going back to families that they had cut ties with. Any trust that people had in members of the public just very quickly eroded. Street markets, they were dimming their lights early, locking up early, and the sounds of footsteps on the street, that would trigger panic attacks in most, because who was it? Was this the murderer? Were they about to be the next victim? Now, the police were under pressure, but they were also constrained by the very nature of the victims. Because according to police, the homeless aren't reliable sources or witnesses. Why? Riddle me that. It kind of sounds like you are judging someone on their circumstances. Police even tried to dismiss these homeless people's murders as inevitable tragedies. Really? If it was your family member, would you still say it was an inevitable tragedy? I think not. And with police saying this, other homeless people, people who are struggling, they start thinking, oh, I might be the next inevitable tragedy. The fear, you could honestly smell it. Now, there comes a point in every single murder case where denial becomes impossible, and this would happen in 1966. At this point, the body count had become far too high, and the similarities in the murders were too precise. The police were at a point where they couldn't write these off as random street killings, no matter how much they wanted to. They were now hunting for something that was far rarer, far more dangerous than anything they've ever faced before. Until the late 1966, police had been handling these murders in isolation in individual police stations. Each precinct was chalking it up to gang violence, drunken street fights, disputes, or crimes of opportunity. But there would be one man, a man by the name of Alex Fiallo. He began to notice the repetition, the location of the blows, the types of wounds, the way that these victims were positioned, and he pushed for a centralized review of all these murders. And when these files were placed side by side, the picture became clear. The victims were almost all from the city's most vulnerable population. The blows, they were consistent. It was a crushing strike to the skull with some kind of blunt, heavy rock or brick. No valuables were stolen. There was no sign of sexual assault, thank goodness. And it was clear that these murders, they weren't vengeance, they weren't robberies gone wrong. This was cold, calculated predation. And then in early 1967, a man would stagger into the police station in the Matunga district. This man was bleeding profusely from a head wound, and his clothes were completely stained with a mixture of dust and blood. He claimed that he had been sleeping rough when this crazed man came up and tried to bludgeon him to death. And in the dim light, before he lost consciousness, he seen his attacker for the first time. We have an eyewitness account. He said that the man was medium height, he was of a wiry build, he had unkempt hair, and he said that he had the eyes of a wild rabid dog. Now, this description was the first tangible lead that the police had, but still this wasn't enough to identify a suspect in a city of millions. But still, it told them something critical, that this killer wasn't a ghost. It wasn't this gang. He could be seen, he could be recognised, and potentially he could be caught. So by mid-1967, the police, they had started mapping out the murders on this grim city board. A grim cluster would emerge in Bychula and also Matunga. There was outliers stretching to Kurla and even further afield. Now, the police had theorised that the killer was transient, that he was moving between these different communities, never staying in one area for too long and always ensuring that he blended in with the public. Now, officers, they were instructed to patrol the area where homeless people were sleeping, so, under bridges, next to railway tracks, near abandoned warehouses, edges of construction zones, underpasses, and all of this was in the hopes that if someone was going to attack, they would be ready to arrest them. But honestly, it was thankless work. It was hours of walking in these different communities, telling men, women and children to stay in groups and be aware, like that stops anything. They were telling the public to keep an eye out, let us know if you see anything. Like, I'm sure they would, but even with these warnings and the walkabouts that the police were doing, the bodies kept appearing, they kept piling up. And as you can probably imagine, by now, the press, they've decided to give the serial killer a huge ego boost and give him a nickname. And they went with the Psycho Killer. Is it original? No. Does it cover the work? I suppose. Headlines would scream, "Another senseless killing, madman on the loose." And of course this just invoked fear into the public, into the homeless population, but it also helped them because it made them realise this danger was real. This was happening, this was going on. Now, men who were sleeping rough, they started carrying sticks and bricks and sleeping with these close to them, basically cuddling into them at night. Families were then sleeping in shifts, keeping an eye out, making sure there was nothing dodgy going on. Some citizens, they had demanded curfews in the areas where the crimes were happening. Others accused the police of doing next to nothing because the police believed that the people who were being murdered were just slum dwellers, which is horrible. And this was quite a dangerous criticism to have, considering the city was already bristling with class divides. Now, it was a simple but overlooked observation that would start zoning in on the suspect pool. And this was the timing of the murders. Now, the timing of the murders, they were occurring between 2 and 4 a.m. This was a time when even the city's sleepless bustle would fall quiet. This told people that the killer operated at night. They were probably moving on foot, and they must live close enough that they're able to walk back to their base before dawn and before their victim being discovered. So undercover or plainclothed officers, they would start working between these hours. They were watching alleyways and public sleeping spots, and they knew that they weren't hunting a man in a mask or a man in a costume. They were hunting a man who probably looked like every other individual in that area. So there's one point in mid-1968 when the police, they see a suspicious looking man loitering near a railway platform long after the trains had stopped. When they approached this man and asked him some questions, he had given them very evasive answers and then suddenly bolted away. Now, this incident was logged and a description was filed because the police are thinking, holy crap, this might be our guy. And they didn't know it yet, but the man that they had spoken to was a man by the name Raman Raghav. That's our guy. That is our guy. By the end of 1968, the murders had slowed, but they hadn't stopped by any means. The police had believed that maybe this meant that the killer had moved, or they might have been laying low. This could have been due to illness, or maybe they've been arrested for another petty crime. But in July of 1968, there would be a new murder in the exact same style, and this would reignite the manhunt. This time, the suspect would be spotted again, but this time, the police were ready. The stage was practically set for the arrest of one of India's most infamous serial killers. For 3 years, this monster had moved through the streets of Bombay like he was just travelling smoke, unseen but very much deadly. The police now knew his face, but all they needed was the opportunity to get close enough to put hands on him. And when they finally did, this hunt would turn into something even darker. Why had this monster killed in the first place? So, July 1968, the police, they spot a man who was hanging out near a railway side shanty. This man was standing very unnaturally near a row of sleeping figures. Now, most people on the street, if they weren't sleeping, they were constantly moving, whether this was out of necessity or whether this was out of nerves. But this guy was weirdly still. I mean, he was statue still. This guy's playing musical statues with someone who, I don't know, but it's definitely someone. So when police approached this man, he didn't run at first. He had just stared at them, and they would later recall that this stare was like one of a rabid animal, possibly a rabid dog. The officers, they start asking questions like, why the hell are you loitering around here looking like a creep? When these questions are getting asked, this man is muttering and mumbling and saying that he's just waiting on someone. But as soon as the police proceed to press harder, this man would bolt. And this is when adrenaline took over, because the police, they didn't know the ins and outs of the shanties and the slums. So this wasn't like a Hollywood police chase where the police are on their tail and tackle them to the ground. It was kind of like watching some sort of slapstick comedy. I mean, the police, they were tripping over chickens and tripping over people who were asleep, trying to catch this man who was basically in a labyrinth. But at this point, the police have the upper hand because they have something now that they didn't have before, and that is the drive and stubbornness to catch this monster. So the police, they are chasing him down, and this killer would find himself in a dead-end alleyway. And at this point I was thinking, oh crap, he's going to climb a fence, he's going to climb a wall, and they're going to lose him. But no, the man, the killer, the murderer, Raman Raghav, he just stares the police down. I don't know if he thought he had like a powerful stare that if he just stared at the police they would disappear or run away. But they didn't. So the police, they are arresting him, and when they go to frisk him, they don't find anything particularly incriminating. In fact, the only incriminating thing about this man was his stench. The guy stunk. But there was no bloodied weapons, there was no stolen goods, there was no murder souvenirs. But his appearance had matched the previous survivor's description to a T, and this was the guy the police had seen previously. The guy even had the wiry frame and uneven teeth that had been spotted before. And when they asked this man his name, he was forthcoming. He stated that his name was Raman Raghav, but he refused to offer any other explanation of why the hell he was creeping around sleeping people at 3 a.m. And that was enough for the police to haul him in. Because listen, if you're creeping around the town's most vulnerable area at murder o'clock, might we add, looking like you've just crawled out of a crypt, you're at least probable murder adjacent. Now, inside the police station, things get weird, right? Because of course the police ask Raman if he knew anything about the murders, like had he heard of the murders, and Raman just turns around and he's like, do you know, I'm actually being followed by a secret society. And the police are like, alright, do you know about these murders though? And Raman's like, in this secret society, they communicate to me telepathically. The police are just like, what the hell does this have to do with our questions? Like, talk sense to us. But then Raman just goes on this rant about how people were poisoning his food, stealing his thoughts, and also interacting with him through machines in the air. And I mean, listen, this isn't exactly the confession that they were hoping for, but this definitely tells them, this guy, he thinks he's special. And all the serial killers do. Now, for days, the police, they were questioning him in what can only be described as marathon sessions. Now, he refused to admit anything directly, but occasionally when a victim was mentioned or a name was mentioned, he would slip up, he would smile, or he would mutter things under his breath, or he would give details that had not been disclosed. Like sometimes he was even given the location of the murder before the police had even mentioned it. So, guilty. Now the real turning point, this would come when police decided to play a little game with him, shall we say. So they would walk him through the neighbourhoods and they would take him through the murder spots. And every time they passed somewhere where someone had been murdered, yet again, they would see that he'd start smiling, he would start muttering to himself. Eventually, Raman, he knows that the jig's up, right? So he starts opening up about these murders in his own twisted way. He didn't talk about them with excitement or remorse. He just spoke about them very matter of fact. You'd honestly think that this guy was just shopping for vegetables at the market. It was so casual and calm. And to him, these weren't murders that he was committing, these were cleansings. He said that the homeless were impure and dirty, and he believed that he was doing some kind of holy work. Now, and I'm just spitballing here, right? But this is a guy who is also homeless. So is he dirty? Is he impure? If so, should he not have himself? Just throwing it out there, what makes him so special? But he's truly thinking that the police are going to believe this whole holy work nonsense that he's on about. And could you imagine him going into court? Like, yes, Your Honour, I did kill 40 plus people, but I was just out here doing the Lord's work. God needed help with sanitation and I was just here pitching in. I'm going to assume that judges aren't going to believe that BS or buy into it. Now, thankfully at this point, the police, they have enough to charge him, okay? Because survivor identification, him smiling at all these murder spots, giving information up before it's even been disclosed, and his half-assed philosophy about why the killings had to happen. Now, some would say that this case was built on circumstantial evidence and testimony, but in Bombay in the 1960s, this was pretty strong. Raman Raghav, he would be charged with multiple counts of murder, and the question at this point wasn't whether he would be convicted, it was whether he would be found guilty, insane, or a combination of both. This was a man who had been invisible his entire life, even by his own mother and father, okay? He was nothing special, he never made an impact, and now he was rotting in this little cell where he now couldn't be ignored. This trial was going to expose him not just for the murderer and psychopath that he was, but also the strange little world he lived in inside his mind. The streets of Bombay, they had been terrified for years by this one monster, and now suddenly they had this morbid fascination. Who had been able to terrorise them for so long? They had once believed that this could be the work of a demon itself, or by some large maniac madman, and instead they're getting this little wiry, bad haircutted freak. So in 1969, the trials would begin, and unfortunately for the people of Bombay, the courtrooms were packed and they didn't have air conditioning. But everyone wanted to see this monster in the flesh. The press swarmed the place, there was sketch artists everywhere, literally elbowing each other to get in for a glimpse of this man. And Raman didn't help matters, okay, because he very much wanted to sensationalise himself now as well. He would enter the court with what can only be described as swagger jagger. But this was the swagger of a man that thought he was the He thought he was the main event. But he's literally stumbling into court in a suit that doesn't fit him because of his wiry build. His hair was just a monstrosity. I mean, really, really terrible. And his eyes were just like dotting around like he was, I don't know, watching flies. Now, the prosecution, they would lay it out very plainly. Raghav was accused of murdering at least 41 people across 2 distinct killing sprees. One in 1965 and another in 1968. The victims were mostly homeless men, women, children, bludgeoned to death in their sleep with blunt objects. Each count had come with details that were so grim that even your most seasoned reporters and investigators, they flinched at the description. Because we were talking heads crushed beyond all recognition, skull fragments scattered around the bodies, blood seeping into the ground. This wasn't the kind of thing that you could hear about and still go out for lunch afterward. Survivors of Raman, they would give their testimony in court. They would describe waking up in the middle of the night to see this man standing over them, this evil, wild-looking creature. The witnesses would recall that exploding pain that they would feel in their skull when they were struck with what they could only describe as an iron rod, before then blacking out and somehow miraculously living to tell the tale. Another woman had come forward and said that she recalled seeing Raman Raghav lurking in the alleyways where these murders were occurring. The police who had helped arrest him, they had gave their own very eerie account of the lead up to this and what took place and what was said. They even described the faint smiles and the mutterings that Raman Raghav would do when they were walking through the neighbourhoods where these killings had occurred. Now, Raman Raghav, his lawyer, his defence attorney, they had probably the worst job in the world, and that was trying to defend a man that was undefendable and who also had no worry about defending himself. The main argument wasn't going to be that Raman Raghav didn't commit the crimes, it was going to be that he was insane whilst he did. Now, psychiatrists would be brought in and they didn't mince their words. They said that he was a diagnosed schizophrenic. He had delusions about secret societies that had been targeting him, and he had been told to purge the impure people of the world. All of this did point to a man who was completely detached from reality. But the prosecution weren't having it because yes, okay, this man might be unwell, but he was also so methodical in what he did. He picked secluded areas, he waited for victims to fall asleep, and he left very little evidence behind. They had argued that madness doesn't usually come accompanied by this sort of tactical patience that this monster exhibited. They painted him as not this confused wanderer that his defence were trying to claim, but as a predator who walked the streets looking for a victim. One who knew exactly what he was doing and exactly how to get away with it. Until now. So after weeks of testimony, witness statements, psychiatric evaluations, the court would find Raman Raghav guilty of all murders. Initially, he would be sentenced to death, and this was a conclusion that drew cheers and whoop whoops from the public within the court, who finally believed that justice was being served. But here's the twist, because he would appeal his sentence, and his sentence would be commuted to life imprisonment. This was on the grounds of mental illness. They didn't find it to be fair to execute a man who was mentally ill. The court had decided that execution wasn't the answer, and instead he would be locked up in Yerwada Central Jail. Whilst he was here, he would live out his days in isolation and be able to mutter to himself whenever he wanted to. To the public, this felt like a very bitter compromise that they felt they had to just go along with. They believed that a man who had slaughtered so many should pay the ultimate price. He should give his life for taking theirs. Whilst there was others who believed that him rotting in a cell for the rest of his life was actually the most fitting thing, a monster trapped in a cage. So now, Raman's days of killing was finally over, and people of the slums, they should have been able to sleep easier, but how could they? Because if Raman could do this, so could anyone else. It was said whilst in prison that Raman Raghav, he would spend his time pacing the very small cell that he was in and the very small bit of outside ground that he would sometimes get to go out and explore. He spent his days talking about secret societies and impurities and cleansings and missions from God, etc., etc. People had said that he was eerily calm most days, but sometimes, out of the blue, Raman would just kick off into violent rages. And there was even some times where that predator stare would come back. He would just stop what he was doing and lock in staring at someone. And it was like a dog ready to attack. In 1995, Raman Raghav, he would pass away from kidney failure. It wasn't the cinematic end that many people had hoped for or expected. No riots or cheering in the streets, no gang-related death, just a slow decay in a cell. The man shrunk into a shadow of himself until he died and became what he believed was a legend. His body was reportedly cremated, and apparently no family member stepped forward to claim him. This man who had once terrorised Bombay was now left in an unmarked grave. Unremarkable, forgotten by most and remembered too vividly for a few who survived. Even today, Raman Raghav's name, it carries a strange weight in Indian criminal history. Because he wasn't just a killer, he was a symbol of something far scarier. The idea that you can be targeted for no reason at all, that death can come quietly whilst you're asleep, with no warning, no logic, and no chance to fight back. Criminologists, they still reference him when they're studying Indian serial killers. How his schizophrenia intertwined with his methodical violence, how he exploited the invisibility of the homeless, and how the city's sheer size allowed him to vanish between murders. Now, in popular culture, filmmakers and writers, they've turned his story into one of fiction. Each retelling of this was blurring the line between fact and fiction. The most infamous adaptation would come decades later, and Bollywood directors, they would use his story to inspire chilling thriller movies, ensuring that his ghost still wandered the screens long after he was gone. People say that the real legacy of Raman Raghav isn't all the bodies he left behind, but the paranoia he instilled. That whisper in the back of your head when you're alone at night, wondering whether the sound you just heard outside your window was the wind or something darker. And if you still believe that monsters only come out after dark, remember this. Some of them are already awake and smiling into the daylight. But my loves, that is it for another true crime and makeup episode. I hope this one was interesting. I hope it's a new case to some of you, and if it's not, hopefully I've been able to add a bit more information if you already knew about it. Before you go today, please make sure you have left a like, a comment and subscribed. Get the notification bell on because, like I've said, I'm here twice a week, every single week, and it's free. Truly though, it would mean the world to me if you could support my channel in some way by leaving a like, a comment. It really helps boost me out to the YouTube algorithm and helps me toward my dreams of doing this full time for you. Any details you need regarding me, myself and I, or any product information that you would like, it is all listed in the description down below. Don't forget to leave your case suggestions in the comments. But that is it for today. Please, please, please remember, be a good person. Do not be a bad person. Stay safe, look after each other, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!